All right. It's great to see everyone. My name is Deborah Yashar, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's Global Existential Challenges seminar, which is hosted by Pierce. It's a monthly seminar that we've been organizing since last year. We really have a terrific lineup this spring. And so I just want to give you the heads up as to what's coming down the pike before I introduce the panel and our speakers for today. So this spring, we obviously have today a panel on crime and punishment. In March, on March 7th, we'll have one on environmental challenges. On April 4th, we'll have another one on global poverty and precarity. And then on May 2nd, to round out the year, we'll have our final panel on Indigenous politics, interrogating autonomy, sovereignty, and inclusion. So as you can see, this is really an effort to host big questions that affect all of us around the world in different sorts of ways, and in particular to learn with and from our colleagues who are working on these issues in a multidisciplinary way. I want to, before I introduce the panel, especially thank Kimberly Bitterman, who's the one who makes all these things happen behind the scenes. So we'll do this at the beginning of the semester. We'll do it again at the end of the semester. But if we could first give her a round of applause and thank her for all that she's done. All right. So today, obviously, we're going to focus on crime and punishment. And there's so much to say here. I will really keep my comments brief to turn it over to the panel. But obviously, there have been all kinds of trends over the last decade or so where crime and violence rates perhaps have gone down in some places, and in other regions, and I'll highlight Latin America in particular, it's really gone up, although with a lot of variation across different countries. And so we wanted to step back and think about these patterns of crime and violence, not only on their own terms, but also thinking about the responses of states and non-state actors when confronted with these issues, and also the differential and uneven impact that violence and crime and punishment have on different societal sectors. So it's not just the fact of crime, it's not just the responses to crime, but also the differential impact it has. And the title for today particularly privileges is the wrong word, highlights the role of race in terms of the differential impact that this has had. But we might think about age, which Mika has also worked on. We could think about gender, we could think about class, and so on and so forth as we think about justice and injustice in the context of crime and punishment. And then finally, I'll just note that our panelists are not just thinking about trends, they're not just thinking about state and non-state responses, they're not just thinking about the differential impact, but they also raise policy implications that we can bring to the table. So there's a lot for us to begin with, a lot for us to consider, and I just want to start off here then by thanking our panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, who are going to share some of their work. They come from different backgrounds, but they all together are puzzling through these issues. So first, we'll start off with Laurence Ralph, who's a professor of anthropology here at the university and also director of the Center on Transnational Policing. And he works on a wide range of topics, but let me just highlight two books in particular. One is Renegade Dreams, Living Through Injury in Gangland Chicago, which won the C. Wright Mills Award from the Society for the Study of Social Problems. And his latest book is Torture Letters, Reckoning with Police Violence, which I saw is also a sticker on your laptop that you were showing that you folks might see afterwards. So he'll start off. Then we'll turn to Patrick Sharkey, who's the William S. Todd Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs, and he's also served as the scientific director at the Crime Lab in New York and is a founder of AmericanViolence.org. He, too, has worked on a wide range of issues related to urban inequality, violence, and public policy. And in addition to many articles, let me highlight a couple of books, Uneasy Peace, The Great Crime Decline, The Renewal of City Life, and the Next War on Violence, as well as Stuck in Place, Urban Neighborhoods, and the End of Progress Towards Racial Equality. And then third, last but definitely not least, is Micaela Sviatschi, who's an assistant professor of economics and public affairs, as well as an affiliate of many different organizations, including CECIFO, NBER, the Political Economy Group, BRED, and the African School of Economics, amongst many others. And her research also spans a wide range of issues, including non-state actors, human capital and development, gender-based violence, and migration. And I'll just highlight a couple of the articles that she has worked on most recently. There are many. One is entitled Making a Narco, Childhood Exposure to Illegal Labor Markets and Criminal Life in Econometrica. Another one is Spreading Gangs, Exporting U.S. Criminal Capital to El Salvador. third, I could go on at length, is market structure and extortion, evidence from 50,000 extortion payments, et cetera. So you can see we have from anthro to sociology to economics, a wide range of topics, but all focusing on this question of crime and punishment in the context of justice and injustice. So we're very excited for the panel. Let me just highlight two other housekeeping issues. This panel is taped, so I just want you to be mindful of that as we're going forward. And then second, each speaker will have about 18 minutes plus or minus to speak. If you see me going like this is not just my saluting them, which I of course always will, but just to let them know that there are about 2 more minutes before their time is up. And then after they all speak, they'll join us at the table for a discussion. So again, give them a warm round of applause and welcome. I will turn it over to you, Laurence.
It's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to see all of you. How should I begin? Well, my name is Laurence Ralph. I'm a professor in anthropology and public affairs here at Princeton. And I just want to begin with just talking a little bit about anthropology and how that informs my approach to these issues of crime and punishment. So anthropology, we pride ourselves on ethnography, the method in which we kind of spend a lot of time with particular communities and study them in a local context and have a kind of in-depth exploration of their world and how they experience the world. And what that means in terms of something like crime, I like to think about it in a couple ways. One is that it complements what we already think we know about the quantitative, about the statistical, about large demographic categories. So it should match some realities that we hear about in terms of, okay, this many African Americans are incarcerated, or these are the effects of mass incarceration from a statistical standpoint. But on the other hand, I like to say it is before we have categories, it's almost like pre-categories, pre-categorization. And what I mean by that is that as an ethnographer, when I enter a community, what I may see is important, maybe something that hasn't been mobilized as a category yet for statistical analysis. I might say that, oh, what I'm seeing is the relationship between disability and gang violence, for instance. And so disability and gang violence might then be later mobilized as a category, and we can say, okay, how many people who are gang involved have been disabled as a result of gun violence? And that was the focus of my first book, Renegade Dreams. I like to say that I study as an analytical object injury as opposed to violence. I like to think about injury because for me, injury entails both violence, but it also entails the possibility of repair and the possibility of healing. So I'm interested in how people experience violence. I'm interested in the causes of violence, but I'm also interested in what people do to repair and what communities do to repair or heal from that violence as well. When I was doing research for Renegade Dreams, one of the things that struck me when I was involved in the community, involved in a lot of non-violent organizing in the community and a lot of anti-gang organizing, is the fact that a lot of young people were in wheelchairs. And it was something that people would talk about and they would always talk around, but they wouldn't quite address the fact that, you know, these young people are in wheelchairs. And it's something that's kind of relatively striking. We often associate canes and wheelchairs with elderly age or a specific form of disabilities, but we don't often think about the impact of violence that can change the trajectory of somebody's life. And so from that vantage point, I started to look at injury as both something that was interpersonal, that can affect somebody on an individual level, but also something that was communal in the sense that there are social injuries that already exist that produce the context for gang violence. And so I wanted to look at what are those social injuries. I looked at gentrification as a kind of social injury that displaces people, that puts them more vulnerable for something like gun violence. I looked at mass incarceration as a kind of social injury. In the context that I worked in, there was a whole generation of people who would otherwise be there that were locked up for decades of their lives. So what does it do to a community when you have 30,000 people who would be there that are not there because they're incarcerated? What does that do to the housing stock? What does that do to the educational system? What does that do to the labor market? And how does that produce a context in which young people especially are vulnerable to gun violence, and they're disproportionately African American? On the other hand, I think what anthropologists also do is to look at post-categorization. And that's like after the variable has been mobilized, after we think that we understand what this thing means that we're measuring, after we think that we understand what crime means, for example, we kind of try to explode that understanding, and we try to explode that category and open it up through qualitative research and say, well, does that understanding of crime actually match people's reality on the ground? And what happens when we take for granted what we think crime means or what we think a gang member means? And that led me to my second research project. While I was doing research on gang violence in Chicago, people would commonly talk about police violence. And this was kind of before, the Black Lives Matter movement took full swing. But people would always talk about the fact that a young person was shot by the police and nothing was going to happen to the police because of that. And they used to often bring up a man named John Burge, and they used to say, well, if nothing happened to John Burge, nothing is going to happen to these other officers that pulled the trigger. And so I started wondering, who was John Burge? And in Chicago, it was almost like folklore at the time. People would often talk about what happened at Area 2 Precinct. So in the 80s and 90s, hundreds of mostly Black men were tortured in police custody. And they were tortured at a particular precinct. And the most, I think, popular aspect of the torture was that they were tortured with a device called the black box. And it was, it turned out to be a device that used to be a military telephone that was transformed into a torture device and used to shock people. And a man named John Burge, who had served in Vietnam, had brought this device back from Vietnam. Presumably he used it to torture people there in that context, and was using it on Black men in Chicago. And over the years, these hundreds of Black men came out one by one and saying that they had been tortured. And for a while, the city of Chicago didn't believe them, predictably. But over time, there was public social movements to bring attention to the torture survivors and say, no, actually, this really did happen. And it expanded from the Burge cases to torture cases after Burge, such that now there is a torture relief commission in Chicago where they are still getting hundreds and hundreds of cases per year, more cases than they can handle, specifically about police torture allegations. And so for my second project, I looked at the history of police torture, but a lot of it stemmed from the fact that the people who were presumed to be tortured were thought of as gang members, they were thought of as criminals. And not only did the police feel like because of that, they could do anything to these men that they wanted, but also initially juries and the public and the media also believed that because these were criminals, you know, even if something did happen to them, that was what happens to criminals behind closed doors when they're in precincts, right? And so part of my work is unpacking what do people think they mean by these ideas of criminal, by crime, by gang member, and how do we unpack and unravel those assumptions? And when we do that, what kind of understanding does that bring? And so I studied the long arc of these torture cases, which I think that arc is still going, but a pivotal moment was in 2015 when the city of Chicago heard a reparations ordinance on behalf of the torture survivors. And they wanted collective resources from the city. And part of the reason why they wanted collective resources is because there's an issue with police settlements, particularly in Chicago. So right now in Chicago, there's a budget for police abuse, which is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And so they calculate that, you know, every year in 2024, the police are going to abuse civilians and we're going to have to pay them. And so we're going to pay them this amount. That amount comes from the taxpayer. And because of that, if you can prove that you've been tortured, right now, you know, you could get $20 million, $10 million, or something like that. But initially, when the first people to file these torture cases proved that they were tortured, they may have gotten $5,000, $10,000, something like that. And so there's been a large discrepancy over time in what it means to be a torture survivor and how you get compensated for that. And it's actually easier now to prove it because there's been this precedent in all these cases, but also because initially people didn't even believe that something like post-traumatic stress disorder existed. And now there's more recognition that torture is not just physical, but it can be psychological as well. And so the reparations ordinance sought to even out those payments to all torture survivors so that at least you can get something, no matter when you were tortured. And it also sought collective resources for the city of Chicago. And part of that initiative was that, one, that there would be a torture justice center that has free counseling for everyone who has suffered from police violence so they can get seen and heard by a professional. Another element of it was that a history lesson about these cases would be taught in Chicago public schools. And so as a professor and as an educator, part of my work has been dealing with the curricular component and thinking through how we can teach this history in Chicago public schools. Part of the way that I did that, which is a real challenge in terms of thinking about, okay, how do you talk about torture to an 8th grader, you know, or a 10th grader? Part of that was to create an animated film, an animated documentary, in which we kind of talk about some of that history. And also to kind of bring convenings together where students can learn from torture survivors themselves. They can also learn from lawyers who tried these torture cases, and they could also learn from the activist community who fought for the torture survivors. And so I just want to end my presentation by just highlighting some of this work that we've been doing in Chicago, because we've also been bringing Princeton students to Chicago to help facilitate events with Chicago public school students. It's a challenge for everyone in this room. It's a challenge for everyone in Chicago to think about, what can I do? What can I add?
The greatest thing we all hold is empathy for the next man. And once you understand empathy for the next person, you can then, understand that person.
I'm kind of torn between the race and black history from the schools, because on one side I'm like, yeah, let them erase it, because let them take their story out and then we can put our story in. But on the other side, if we allow them to take black history out, it creates a cookie cutter for what they can do openly to us.
I was immediately compelled when I learned that you were writing a book to address this issue that was comprised of letters, right? It immediately made me think of James Baldwin's letter to his nephew, Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I just think that the letter format really does lend itself to a kind of intimacy that we desperately need in our movement and our campaigns to end police violence.
It's about looking at the root causes as to why we see violence. Our current police departments and our current security officers are not, in fact, stopping violence.
So today I asked Black America, and pretty much all of America, to help us wake up.
All right, thank you.
Okay, that's not bad. Thanks, Deborah, for bringing us together, and thanks, Kimberly, for organizing this. So I'm going to talk about some research that I've been doing on trying to understand trends in violence, make sense of what we've seen, not just over the past few years, but over the past few decades. And this is kind of an epilogue to the book that you see here, which was an empirical attempt to make sense of how the decline of violence in the 1990s transformed U.S. cities and transformed the experience of urban inequality in the U.S. And then what I've done since is added to that and really kind of tried to come to an understanding of what has changed more recently, say post 2014. But that's where I want to start. I want to start with this graph. So this is the murder rate in the U.S. Running from 1960 to 2014. And 2014, the book came out in 2018, but I really started writing it in 2014. And that's an important year because the murder rate hit 4.4 murders per 100,000 residents in 2014. We don't have great data before 1960, but the data that we have suggests that this was probably the safest year in American history. The murder rate might have fallen a little bit lower in the 1950s, but at least going back to 1960, this is as low as the murder rate has been in the U.S. And, this was a trend, this decline in violence. This was a trend that hit every major city in the country. So the green circles here are places where violence fell. And so you had this overall national decline where violence fell by about half. But then you had cities, and New York is the poster child here, where the murder rate fell by 85% or so. But it wasn't just New York. It was LA, it was DC, it was Dallas, Fort Worth, Minneapolis, San Diego. These were all places where violence fell by 75% or more. And the city literally transformed. The experience of urban poverty was entirely different before and after the decline of violence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that trend. But if we bring this a little bit closer to home and think about Philadelphia, so Philadelphia did not have this transformation that New York had. Philadelphia right now is the most violent big city in the country. When I say big city, I mean 1 million plus residents. Philadelphia has the highest rate of violence. But even in a city like Philadelphia, which didn't completely transform, we saw this shift. This is from 1990 to 2014, where the murder rate fell by about half over this period. So the point I'm trying to make here is that even if we don't just focus on the places that were completely transformed by the decline of violence, this affected every city, almost every city across the entire country. The empirical work that went into the book, and I'm going to skip through some of these slides very clearly without really explaining what they show, and I'll just state the point out loud. But the argument that I made in the book and the empirical work that went into the book showed that this was not a change that was primarily focused on kind of, this wasn't about the Village and Midtown in Manhattan. The greatest changes took place in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. Okay, and so what this graph is, these two graphs are showing us, this is just the average level of community violence for poor and non-poor residents in these 6 cities. This is before violence started to fall. This is after violence started to fall. So again, poverty still means living with a higher level of community violence, but the experience of urban poverty changed in a fundamental way from the period before the 1990s, when violence was at extreme levels, to the period in the mid-2010s. The level of community violence for the average low-income resident, at least of these 6 cities, after the crime drop, was about the same level of community violence as it was for the average non-poor resident of those cities before the crime drop. Okay, so that's the scale of change that took place. The experience of urban poverty changed in a fundamental way. And the argument I make in the book that this was a breakthrough in many ways. If we just look at life expectancy, so we developed a method to estimate what life expectancy for these 4 groups. These are the only 4 groups, so you can do this for a long time frame with sufficient data. So I'm not under the illusion that we live in a black and white country, but we can look at black and white men and women over a long period of time. We can't do it for other ethnic groups. And so what this exercise showed is when you estimate what life expectancy would have looked like had it not been for the drop in murder over this period, the impact on life expectancy for white women, black women, and white men was not enormous. For black men, it was enormous. This was probably the most important public health advancement over the past several decades for black men. Okay, so the improvement in life expectancy from the actual decline in the murder rate that took place over this period was roughly the equivalent to estimates, the best estimates we have showing the change in life expectancy that one would expect if obesity were eliminated. Okay, if not a single person in this country was overweight, we would get an improvement in life expectancy that was about the drop that we actually got 4/5 of a year from the actual decline in the murder rate that took place in the US. Okay, so that's a scale of change that we're talking about. And then the benefits extended into schools, reduced racial achievement gaps in the places where violence fell the most, and then extended later into life. So I'm just showing you the scatter plot here, but the paper here is using designs that exploit shocks in violence to estimate, okay, how does this affect long-term economic outcomes for young people living in environments where violence is falling? And our estimates suggest that the benefits of the crime drop did not just affect cognitive functioning, did not just affect stress levels, did not just affect sleep patterns, but they extended later into life. Why? Because it affects the local labor market. It affects how far kids remain in school. And through these and other mechanisms, it then affects their early experiences in terms of getting jobs and entering the labor force. Okay. Okay. So to quickly sum up the empirical argument about the drop in violence, there are a few big conclusions here. A, the fall of violence was very real. It affected almost every major city. The greatest benefits were experienced in the most disadvantaged communities. And we should see this as a public health breakthrough with very tangible, concrete benefits that were targeted toward the most disadvantaged segments of the population. Okay, so that's the positive story. Now, why did I call the book Uneasy Peace? So I'm going to just read here from the preface of the book. And this came out in 2018. So this was after some of the major incidents, the Eric Garner case, where Eric Garner was choked to death in New York. This was after Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. But it is before the Black Lives Matter movement really kind of took hold and became a national movement. Or it's just around that time, I should say. And so what I wrote in the preface, the decline in violence that changed urban America is fragile. It is threatened by the resentment of police officers who have been asked for the past 20 years to take over dangerous city streets by any means necessary, and who are now being vilified in some quarters and told to change the way they do their jobs. It is threatened by the outrage of the many Americans who are now aware of the scale of mass incarceration, and the protesters who have now seen how police officers have long treated residents of the nation's poorest, most segregated neighborhoods. It is threatened by the election of Donald Trump, whose law and order rhetoric is a reminder of the language Richard Nixon used back in 1968, just before the last century's sharpest rise in violence occurred. And lastly, it is threatened by a broader, more troubling trend that has been developing for the past 40 years, the rise of urban inequality. So the argument that I was really trying to make here is that the model that the U.S. had developed to deal with extreme urban inequality had created the conditions for persistent vulnerability to violence. Okay, so you can use brute force to control violence. You can do that. But when you do that, it weakens communities. It does not strengthen communities. And the argument I was making is that we did not develop an underlying model to deal with concentrated disadvantage and everything that comes with it. That was the motivation for the title, Uneasy Peace. Okay, so to spell that out a little bit, the argument is that if we go back to the 1960s, when the challenges of extreme urban inequality became more visible, and I'm talking here not just about violence, but the rise of widespread joblessness, the decline of institutions in central cities. And so, that's a very vague language. What I mean is that when poverty became more and more concentrated, it meant that local public institutions lost the resources, lost the population that had made them functioning environments for people to come together in space. So I'm talking about schools, I'm talking about community centers, talking about churches. All of the institutions that provide the foundation for community life started to lose political influence, started to lose the population of residents who came together, started to lose resources, okay? When all of that happens, you create the conditions for violence to emerge. It's not like it automatically translates into higher levels of violence, but when people retreat from public spaces, when conditions in public spaces are not maintained, it creates the possibility for violence to emerge in that vacuum. Okay, so the argument here is that if you go back to the 1960s, the narrative to explain why joblessness was increasing so dramatically, why pollution was becoming this issue that was so glaringly visible in central cities, why schools were falling apart, why churches were depopulating and losing their congregants. All of this can be explained as a function of inequality and injustice. You see that in the top left quadrant, or as a function of lawlessness and disorder. And the argument I make in the book, and drawing on other people's work, doing historical work on this period, is that in the second half of the 1960s, this lawlessness and disorder narrative took hold and became the dominant way to understand what was happening in central cities. That then led to a policy regime focused on abandonment, withdraw federal and state resources from central city neighborhoods, and punishment. Turn to the institutions of the police and the prison to solve all of these problems that come when you have areas of concentrated disadvantage. So this works through several mechanisms, and I won't go into detail here, but the basic idea is that when communities lose when disadvantage becomes concentrated in space, when communities lose resources, then they become vulnerable to rising violence. And that vulnerability never went away, even as violence started to fall because of these brute force policies that were implemented. Okay, so this leaves us in cities like Philadelphia with communities on a map. And this is labeled incorrectly, I realized. This is not upward mobility, this is a poverty rate in Philadelphia's neighborhoods. And the darkest shaded red here are the areas with the highest levels of concentrated poverty. Okay, so this leaves us with sections of Philadelphia where poverty is concentrated. These are the same sections where incarceration is concentrated, as Laurence just referred to. And these are all also the neighborhoods where violence is most concentrated. Okay, not a shock, but this is what happens when there's large-scale disinvestment in communities and a turn to the institutions of punishment as the solutions to concentrated poverty and joblessness. Okay, so this is the first part. This is now like the epilogue portion of the book where I'm trying to make sense of, okay, we saw this decline of violence. I'm calling it an uneasy peace. Now, why are American cities in particular particularly vulnerable to the next wave of violence, to these shocks and violence that occur over time? The first part of the answer is that our response to our nation's response to the urban crisis of the 60s led to concentrated disadvantage, disinvestment, I mean political disinvestment, as well as just extraction of resources. Declining local institutions, a reliance on law enforcement, and the progression toward mass incarceration. And then there's a second dimension, and that is the prevalence of guns. And this was a blind spot in the book, and I've spent the years since trying to get better data to understand what role the prevalence of guns has on these questions. And better data are emerging, so we're making a little bit of progress, but we still don't have the greatest evidence to really make strong claims about the role guns have played in this. But this is, I think, now the best estimate of household firearm ownership. Comes from a group at the RAND Corporation using a whole bunch of different ways to measure this. We don't measure this at a national level, so you have to use some proxies and some survey measures, which are not all that reliable on their own. But you put them together, and I think this is the best estimate we have of trends in gun ownership. What you'll notice here is that from the early 1990s through the mid-2010s, we had a pronounced drop in gun ownership. And this was not widely known that this took place. But looking at the data now, in retrospect, this is another estimate from a paper that a doctoral student here, Megan Kang, in sociology developed, where another proxy, again, we don't have a measure of gun ownership that we can really rely on, so we use these proxies. One of the proxies is the percentage of suicides carried out with a gun, okay? Imperfect in a lot of ways, but it's widely used. This is one of the widely used measures, proxies for gun ownership. And what Megan has shown in her work is that if you go all the way back to 1950, the percentage of suicides carried out with a gun rose all the way till the start of the 1990s. Then it plummeted, and only more recently has it ticked back upward. Okay, so this is another hint that this might be part of the resurgence of violence. Then when you look at background checks by the FBI, you see this slow period for a long period of time. Then in about 2013, we see this sharp rise, that's handguns on the top, long guns on the bottom, with an accelerating spike in 2020 and 2021. And so a lot of the empirical work that I'm doing now is looking at the impact of this large spike in gun ownership and in gun laws at the state level to understand the consequence or what role this played in contributing to the recent rise of violence. Okay, so two pieces of the argument for why the U.S. American cities remain vulnerable to rising violence, even after a period where the murder rate dropped so dramatically. Okay, so when I wrote the book, I argued that it was a precarious piece, that we hadn't solved the problem of urban inequality, hadn't addressed it in a way that would actually strengthen neighborhoods. In the years since 2014, the murder rate has risen by about 50%. You look at a city like Philadelphia, where violence fell by roughly half, and then this is what has happened in the years since. The murder rate has gone up to the highest levels of the past several decades. This hasn't just happened in Philadelphia, so this is 91 to 2014, and then from 2014 to 21, almost every major city has seen a sharp rise in violence in the years since. And again, just as the greatest benefits of the crime drop were experienced in the most disadvantaged communities, when violence rises, it hits the poorest communities hardest. So this bottom cell that I've circled here just shows that the increase in poor neighborhoods has been substantially larger than the increase in non-poor neighborhoods. So there's been no spatial redistribution of violence in the years since. Okay, so this leaves me with three questions. This is the work that I'm doing now, and I'm just going to pose the questions and then I'll stop. The first is, how do we reduce violence right now in every neighborhood and city across the country? And this is the urgent question. This is where I spend a lot of my policy work, is dealing with this question at the city level. But then there are a couple of broader questions. How do we make American communities less vulnerable to the next wave of violence, whatever the source? And then third, how do we do so without the costs that come with aggressive policing and mass incarceration? In other words, how do we turn away from the institutions of punishment as essential responses to the way that we deal with violence? Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. So let me talk about two types of violence that I work on. And I think that in the last part, I'm going to try to shed light to the questions that you put about how we deal with these issues of violence, taking out massive incarceration and aggressive policing. But let me just motivate a bit more, given that this is from another context, which is organized crime. I study a lot the violence generated by gangs, drug trafficking organizations. And just to give you some context, wait, let me take this out. Organized crime has killed as many people as armed conflicts around the world. And criminal organizations have been responsible for the recent increase in violence in cities in developing countries. And as I said, even though organized crime is all across, this is an index of organized crime across the world, it is particularly concentrated in developing countries, in cities, and in particular in Latin America. So this is one type of violence that I'm going to talk. And the second one is that there are other sources of violence that are more socially accepted, which are also important and generates a lot of negative socioeconomic consequences. And one is gender violence. And the first thing is that we have that gender violence is mostly underreported. Just for you to have an idea, only 40% of rapes are reported to police authorities. And even when they are reported, only 16% lead to a conviction. And this problem can be even larger for other types of gender violence, for instance, strict sexual harassment, which is something that I study in my research, which generates negative socioeconomic consequences. For instance, being harassed in the streets affects at what times you work, which type of jobs you select. And this can be even worse when you have certain actors that have different social norms of agreeing whether gender violence is a problem or not. So the questions that I try to answer in my research across different papers is, the first one is try to understand the life cycle of organized crime. For example, how do they search? Why a child decides to be part of a criminal organization or not? what are the consequences beyond violence that organized crime generates in communities where they settle or in villages, in rural areas, in the case in Mexico, and then talk a bit about the potential ways to break this cycle. Then in terms of the gender-based violence, which, as I said, is another source of violence that exists, I try to understand how social norms may interact with their incidents, and also, once we understand this, what can we do as policymakers to reduce this type of violence? And in particular, as I said before, how can we change social norms of relevant actors like police officers that are supposed to deal with this gender violence, but maybe they may have attitudes that are not aligned with their job duty. So let's go with the first part of organized crime and the causes. So one of the causes of why a person decides to be part of a criminal organization is very similar to any other occupation in the legal sector, which is the high profits that these criminal activities can bring. No? You live in a neighborhood where you have informal jobs, and also you have also this path into crime because there are these criminal organizations that recruit. And so this will affect your decisions at an early age of which different paths you choose. And in particular, in the case of Peru, I studied a lot the drug trafficking industry, cocaine, because the country is suitable to produce coca. And what I see is that children that live in rural villages that are suitable to produce coca, when you have an increase in the return to this illegal activity, parents send their kids to work in these coca farms. And although this is not something bad, no, collecting coca leaves, the problem is that since it is the drug industry there, and there are cartels, is that these kids have also contact with other stages of productions. And then they acquire this criminal capital at an early age, and this put them in this path of crime in drug trafficking. And this is what I'm showing here in this graph. You will see that here you have the incarceration rates related to drug trafficking and violent crime. And in the x-axis, you have the different ages that you have as a kid if you were living in an area where the drug industry evolved. And also you have, an increase in the returns to be part. And what you see here is that if you were in your early teens, you are much more likely to be incarcerated in the future when you are adult for drug-related or violent crimes. So, and this affects because, and the main mechanism here is that they acquire criminal capital, but at the same time, there is a decline in their human capital because these children, they drop out from school to be part of this drug industry. So this allows them to specialize. And as you can see, it's very early on that this affects you. So even before the age 15. Of course, there are other factors about how these criminal organizations, they expand. And one is the movement of criminals across the space. And this has been the case for Central America. And we are also seeing now with criminals, leaders of criminal groups in Venezuela moving across the region. But let me focus on the case of Central America, which is that in one part of my research, I find that when the US changed in 1996 their Immigration Act, which basically made it easier to deport individuals with criminal records, and in that wave there were gang leaders that developed actually in the US. They were the sons of immigrant families that were living in tough neighborhoods, and these gang leaders were sent back to Central America. What we see is an increase in homicides, and most importantly is that they increase the gang recruitment. So here what I'm showing you, this is the difference between neighborhoods where these gang leaders from the US settle and the homicide rates. And you can see that after 1996, you see a special increase in homicide rates in those neighborhoods where these gang leaders settle. And of course, they don't do it by themselves. It's like they, as I said before, they recruit children, and the early exposure is very important because we see that children that are most vulnerable in these neighborhoods when these gang leaders arrive, they start recruiting. And here, different than in the case of the drug industry, these gang members basically brought a social community, an identity. So a lot of kids wanted to join actually these gangs at the beginning in Central America. And this actually shows the case that this is the ages that they have in 1996 when these gang leaders from the US arrived in the neighborhoods in El Salvador. And I can look at the incarceration rate of these kids when they are adults. And I can see whether they are related to these gangs with US origin or not. And again, you see that early exposure is very important. If you were younger than 15 years old, you are more likely to be part of these criminal organizations. There is also a role, and actually a role of the prisons also to expand. So what the region did when these gang leaders arrived was to try to deal with this with crackdowns, massive incarcerations. And actually, we have ongoing work where we see that actually the system is not prepared, especially because we see that when they mix members of criminal organizations, especially higher up, with normal, criminals that are there for petty crime, what you see is that this criminal was not there for a gang-related crime of these criminal organizations. Once they are released, if they share the prison with them, they are more likely to then be part of these criminal organizations. And this is what we are trying to show here. Basically, how you can think about this is these are the rates of reincidence. And we see that if you were exposed several semesters in your same cell with these criminal gang leaders, you are more likely that then you go back to crime, but not on the crimes that you were doing before, but crimes related with gangs. The consequences. The consequences, I think that we all agree that there are a lot, in particular violence, as I showed you before, homicides, but there are also other consequences beyond this violence. And one is that, in general, in Latin America, when these criminal organizations expand, they start controlling territory that is supposed to be of the state. And basically, if you want to enter these locations, you need the permission of the criminal leaders to enter to these locations. So something that I did with several co-authors was, let's try to understand how are the socioeconomic conditions of people living in these neighborhoods controlled by gangs relative to individuals that just live across the street in neighborhoods that are not controlled by gangs. These are socioeconomic characteristics. And we see, and this is the meters that you are further from the gang boundary. So because they put these invisible borders for you to be allowed or not to enter. And you can see that they have worse socioeconomic characteristics than individuals that live just across the street. So these discontinuities are very high. And as I said, beyond all these effects of violence, these also affect how people make decisions. No? And something that we see is that if you are a household and you live in these gang-controlled territories, they also restrict your mobility. So you are much more likely to not be able to work outside a gang-controlled territory. And this is mainly because the gangs control where do you move, where do you work. And because they do this because they don't want you to be working in a neighborhood that is controlled by a rival gang. So they generate all these discontinuities in individual decisions. So how can we prevent this? No? This is the big questions. And traditional measures, as you have seen here in the US, and my colleagues have been talking, like crackdowns can be very costly. And we have seen also this in the case of Latin America, that crackdowns can have unintended effects such as police violence, false positive, and this also can end up harming, trust in institutions in the long run. Maybe you don't see it in the short run, but then in the long run you can start seeing. So one alternative that I have been exploring a lot and trying to work with governments in different countries, with previous governments in El Salvador, in Peru, and in Chile, is how can you shift these economic incentives? So we know that these organizations basically feed from young individuals. And they do this mainly because they cannot be legally prosecuted. So how can we increase them the cost of recruiting children that are part of their organization at an early age? And one thing can be shifting economic incentives through conditional cash transfers. Basically, I give a transfer to the family with the condition that kids stay longer in school. This we have seen in Peru that can work to reduce the exposure of these children early on into the drug industry. And then using the police, but in the good ways that we want, as preventive. We can train them for preventive measures, and this is something that we are studying, how the use of police prevention in school surroundings, in strategic times where we know that these gang leaders recruit children early, how we can prevent the recruitment. And another policy that I'm studying in Peru is a program in schools to internalize. It's not that much about internalizing the cost of violence, but mostly trying to use school actors that can capture early on, or community leaders, when a kid is in risk of joining gangs or being, doing something much more violent, so that then you can reorient their behavior. And I'm going to talk, how many minutes I have? I'm good? Okay, Perfect. So this is, I'm going to skip this one because I talk. So let me show you the one of how we can use the police and make it effective without having police violence. So basically, in El Salvador in 2015, they have this program that increased police, basically, no, they didn't increase the number of police officers. They just reoriented, so they trained them for prevention. And instead of them being police patrolling these neighborhoods homogeneously across the neighborhood, they put them in the entrance and exit of school, no? Like at the times that kids are out and entering. At the beginning, you might be thinking, now we have seen all this of the police violence. This can be very dangerous. That's why I'm saying that it is important that which police officers you choose to do these things and the training component. But it is very interesting that it seems so we have data on dropout rates administrative. So I can know all these schools that they receive these police officers patrolling. And we can see again that at the ages that gangs tend to recruit, you see a big decline in dropout. These are like about 12, 15 years old. These are the different grades in school. And we also have interesting data on gang recruitment. How we measure gang recruitment is that they have in El Salvador, they used to have, I don't know if they have it now, this intelligence unit, which they use informants from the field, like community leaders, like basically priests, to tell them when a kid was at risk of being part of gangs or not, or recruited. So, and they have all this database that we got access, and we can see that after the policy started, you see this decline in gang recruitment. And the nice thing is that we see it exactly in the ages that they had that gangs recruit, which are these early teens. And the nice thing is that at the beginning, you might be thinking, we're using police and this can increase, incarceration. But actually, we see the opposite, that there is a decline in the incarceration of kids. So this is in line with this policy that was mostly preventive. So the guideline for these police officers was mostly to prevent and do campaigns. Also, another component of the program was that police officers would talk at school about the consequences of joining gangs and showing how they have the community to help them. And also we have some data on police violence from an NGO there, and we don't see any increase in police violence. Then the other thing that, and this I think is one of the last things that I would say, because probably I don't have 0 minutes, which is this that they have done in Peru. So in Peru, they have this program that they did also in 2015, which was, okay, we see in the schools that very early on in these very poor neighborhoods, kids start being violent, and this is not just bullying. It's like they bring weapons to school, they have like extreme ways of physical violence, like threatens deaths at schools. So how can we deal with this? And there is, of course, a problem here, because a lot of these communities don't want to report, no? You don't want to report to police because then you think that these gangs can retaliate against you. So they were like, how can we change this early on in schools? And also, how can we change the reporting, like the norms against reporting, no? Because on the one hand, when you were visiting these communities, people were saying, we don't want to report because if we report, they can retaliate against us. And at the same time, some of them are kids. And we know that if we report them to the police officers, then we put them in this criminal path and access to criminal justice. And they wanted to think about what to do with this problem. And what they decided was to do these pilots through a randomized control trial in some schools, where they not only put a new system on how to report violence, but also a new system about how to deal with violence early on, which was basically through a psychologist, a tutoring teacher, through talks in classes at these key ages that I was telling you. And mostly it was that an anonymous platform that you could tell when you see someone in risk of being part of a gang member. And importantly, in the talks that they had, the workshop for kids, they were also mentioning about how if you don't report now, maybe this violence can escalate, and we have a new form on how to address this violence that does not involve, the police. And actually, so far, this seems to be very successful. And it's a combination of two things: workshops to these kids to try to understand, the consequences of violence, and also a new way to deal with this violent behavior. And for instance, we see that in those neighborhoods that were schools treated, you see a high decline in violent crimes. Also, this is the grade that they have, like the worst behavior. So you see that there is a decline in the worst behavior grade, and also in the probability of carrying weapons. So this seems to be something that you could do, especially when kids start entering a young age. I will not have time, sorry, to talk about the gender violence, but here what we tried to do was to work with police officers to reduce sexual harassment in the streets. And we evaluate the presence of police officers in hotspots that are known for street harassment, which are basically bus stops, markets where women are harassed, and we randomize which ones they will have this special police that was supposed to target these crimes. And the bottom line here is that as an overall, we don't see any effects. We only see a reduction in sexual violence, and I will keep, this is police officers, only in the severe cases like touching, stalking, something that is very bad. And we're like, why we are not seeing effects on mild cases like catcalling, verbal threats, which we know that they are penalized by the Indian code, but we don't see any reduction, and we send police to target that. And what we found is that actually we did this based on about attitudes, about how much these police officers that were trained, but very little to target these type of crimes, their views about sexual harassment, and the vast majority thought that it was not a police duty. But when we interact these effects with police officers that have the views aligned with their police duty, you see a reduction in overall cases of harassment. So this moves us to the last thing that I wanted to say, is like now we are working in our state in Bihar to try to see how we can change the views of police officers in their training, to have a very intense training so that we can shift these views so that they can know that this is also a police duty. And that's all. Thank you so much.
Have a little over 10 minutes to take questions. Go forward, and I'm struck by the fact that we started with references to empathy and intimacy and everyday social norms, even though very different disciplines. So I'm going to invite them to sit down and ask who would like to pose a question. Yes, Lucy. And when I call on you, if you could just say your name and where you are. I oftentimes know who you are, but just for those.
My name is Melu Sinkomam. Yes, as an associate research scholar. My question to everyone, but specifically for Laurence, I just wanted to find out how this violence in American cities speaks to the exercise of sovereignty by the American state. So from the graphs that you showed, seems that it peaked in the 80s, also peaked now, 2014. How does this relate to the goings on outside the borders of America, and how the American state is trying to assert itself amongst its citizens vis-a-vis the threats that might be coming from outside? Because 2014, for some reason, also coincide with the flexing of muscles in Russia, with Crimea and so forth. And in the 80s, it was towards the end of the Soviet Union, and a lot of things was going on. And then there is this coincidence of rising crime and punishment by the state in America. So I want you to speak to the exercise of sovereignty and control in American cities or anywhere in America by the American state.
So I'm going to make a recommendation. Why don't we take a few questions and then we'll bring it back to the group. Other questions?
I'm Elizabeth Levin. I'm a physician from the community. I just wanted to ask Laurence, what happened to the police officers who were found guilty of torture?
Maybe one more question. Start there. I have others.
Okay. I'll start with that question. So they weren't exactly found guilty of torture in the criminal sense. They were found, the city was found liable civilly in civil cases. So what happened to them, oftentimes from a sanction standpoint, not much happened to most of them. For the main person, John Burge, he was eventually fired. but he still received his pension until he died. And so that's also part of the reason why the settlements approach doesn't work, because oftentimes the settlements come with a condition that you can't even speak about it publicly, so it affects people's ability to file civil cases. And oftentimes the civil cases pay out in the best case scenario, but it doesn't demand anything of the police department or the individual officers. And so that's part of the outrage of the social movement. I think in terms of the other question, I think that in terms of, when we think about sovereignty, when we think about the state, I think just on a basic level, the police represent governance in the sovereign sense of the word, because they can collapse the legislative and executive branches of governance in an instance through police discretion. So oftentimes you'll hear colloquially people say, the police officer, he acted as judge, jury, and executioner on the spot, right? And who else in society can do that besides police officers? Can determine that because somebody threatened them, that they can enact the kind of deadly force that can take their life in an instance without, going through the due process that's supposed to characterize American democracy. So I think that would be, like, on a philosophical level, the role that the police play vis-a-vis sovereignty. But I will say the other aspects of your question dovetail with the process of militarization and increasing militarization of the U.S. police force, where traditionally the sensibility of us versus them was thought to pertain to exceptional times, times of war, and to foreign entities. But I think in the moments that you talked about, and also increasingly, you have actual weapons, materials, armors, tanks, things that were used for war coming back into the domestic sphere, particularly through the U.S. law, the 1033 ordinance, in which basically any police department can kind of go online and say, oh, I would like this armored truck for my unit, and they can get it free or at a substantially reduced price from the federal government. And so since then, since the initiation of 1033, you've had more than $40 billion worth of military weapons and materials coming back domestically. And these are the kind of flak jackets, armored trucks, tear gas materials. These are the things that are used in places like Ferguson or places like Baltimore when there are riots and things like that. And so you see it in a kind of a sociological sense in that way, where the exercise of sovereignty correlates to the kind of international debates that you were referring to, and plays out on American soil.
I have no other questions. Let me just. Oh, Stacy.
Hi, Stacy Mann. I'm a historian, but I run the New Jersey project at SPIA. My question is for Pat. All of the talks were really good. I found it so helpful the way you laid out the narrative, sort of the alternating narrative to explain and describe the violence. And But I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the material dimensions and the particular policies that you think that help explain the 2014 drop, and how they interacted maybe with the narratives that were available to be released and taken up by the public voters.
Before you answer, if you're ready to go, I'm going to bring in Micaela.
Yeah. So my name is Micaela. I'm a historian. I work at the Brazil Lab here in Piers. I have two quick questions, one to Laurence. The first one, Laurence, I was wondering if during your field work you could see the transnational scale of torturing in the case of America. You mentioned that this technology was probably brought from Vietnam, right? But the US also exported that to Latin America. So if you saw something like, for example, in the training of the police officers, how they were trained, did they learn on the field, like in Vietnam and then in Chicago, or there was some kind of training because the US trained the military in Latin America, for example, the Brazilian military who were brought here, and after that the Brazilians trained other military men in Latin America on how to torture and how to extract information from communists, for example, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Sumika, I was wondering also about training and how is the reception on the side of the police officers that you were training in terms of the harassment, and if there is any backlash in that experience. Thank you.
All right, so you each have meaty questions in about 2 minutes each to answer. Why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think that it's a very good question because there was resistance to do the training, and we only were able to them to come to do the training when higher ups were actually caring about this issue, and that's how we got it. So basically, our first, I remember, meeting that they have to be trained. We have like 1/3 telling of the police officers should be there. Where so how we got it is that someone super up was very in line with the interest that we have of the research and caring about this as a policy issue. And the same was with the case of Hyderabad. The program, they already had it. So they have this program of she teams to be targeting sexual harassment. And that's how it makes it, like, you know, I can't convince anyone unless there is a higher up or they are ready, like, this willing to target these issues.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Stacey. So my reading of what happened from, let's say, 1970 till 1990, first off, till 2014. First off, we had a continuing rise of violence that went all the way through the early 1990s. And that was a period where, you know, the rate of incarceration in the U.S. has been incredibly stable throughout the country's history until 1970, when it began to skyrocket. So stable that it was a law in criminology that there was a steady state level of incarceration. This was Al Bloomstein, famous theory, fantastic researcher, came out with this argument at a bad time because then the incarceration rate skyrocketed in the years after he came out with that argument. So what we had was a huge scale up of the incarceration system. Now that had an impact on violence. Okay, and this is one of the points that I make, particularly when talking with progressives about these issues. You know, when we're talking about why violence rises or falls, we want to make an argument that is consistent with evidence, and then discuss, okay, what are the implications of this? What does this mean for moving forward? So the rise in incarceration rates had an impact on violence. The turn toward police had an impact on violence. Police can reduce violence, okay? It comes with substantial costs. It comes with 1 in 1,000 black men being killed by police officers. It comes by weakening communities over a longer time frame. So to discuss it, obviously, I like to kind of emphasize that, like, you don't have to make a case that police can't reduce violence in order to argue against the police as a dominant institution. So the argument I make is that these kind of brute force approaches to dealing with joblessness and violence and widespread economic dislocation played a role in reducing violence. But the other thing that happened in the 1990s is there was a mobilization that took place in the communities hit hardest. So what you see in the 1990s is that, we got a national data set and nonprofits to make this point or to really discover this trend, is that there was an enormous mobilization in the communities hit hardest by violence that was funded or at least helped by federal resources that became available in the 1990s. And that led to the formation of community centers, local health clinics, groups that formed, particularly around that time, to take back public spaces, to take back parks. And these stories are all told in individual accounts of these heroic efforts, and they were heroic efforts. But what that approach misses is that this happened on a large scale. It happened across the country, and we can demonstrate the causal impact that this played in contributing to the crime drop. So it gives us a proof of concept for saying, all these other brute force approaches can reduce violence. They come with staggering costs, and we've seen the costs of that approach. There is another approach that can be taken when you invest in community organizations, and that can play a central role in transforming their own communities. We have a huge body of evidence that makes it very clear that community organizations can play a central role, can have a causal effect on violence. But the argument that I'm making is that we've just never invested in that approach on a large scale.
I think that is something I'm really interested in, and part of my work tracks the circulations of ideologies that come from trainings and things like that, but also materials in terms of torture devices and also personnel. And so I'm looking at, some Chicago police officers who go to the military, or in one case, I look at a Chicago police officer who then goes to Guantanamo Bay and tortures someone at Guantanamo Bay. That person writes a best-selling book, and then they look at his record and say, oh, he did all this in Chicago too. But before, when it was exposed, what he did in Guantanamo, what he did in Chicago wasn't even considered torture. People didn't read it as torture. They read it as abuse or misconduct. And so part of what I'm interested in is when does something become torture? And often it's vis-a-vis a national or international comparison. And so I'm very interested in when can we make those comparisons when we're actually talking about the same thing? And part of the way you can do it is by tracking those circulations that you're referencing.
There is so much more to say, and I'm going to try and wrap up an impossible conversation. Just a few words. First of all, of course, I want to thank our three speakers for sharing their work. Each of them could have occupied days and days of important conversation about the issues of cancer. First of all, thank you for that. Secondly, I just want to reiterate that while the title of the panel was about crime and punishment, one of the key issues really that came through is to think about this in terms of not just punishment, but also thinking about both the preventative and, you had said in your talk, Laurence, also to think about repair. Of course, the social policy issues are about that. They're really thinking about building up a welfare state, whether or not it's education, whether or not it's about economic development, whether or not it's about community-based development that provides preventative kinds of policies, not only to prevent children from joining, but also those who've entered or been affected by crime to have other opportunities. So again, welfare states and punishment are two sides of the same coin. I think you've really highlighted that in an important way. The last thing I want to say is, as a Latin Americanist, and so Mika and Micaela and I, of course, are thinking about this partially from the perspective of Latin America, is that the rise of violence has also led to the rise of a kind of penal populism, which is to say a series of state responses that are highlighting the punishment side of responding to crime, oftentimes at the severe expense of basic civil rights. And so El Salvador is a really prime example of that. And it raises this question of not just what we think as policymakers we should do, and not only how to think about this at the community level, but in democracies or autocratizing cases in Latin America like El Salvador, there are populations that are voting in elected officials who are prioritizing responses that are really punitive, and punitive at the expense of civil rights. And so I'll just share one survey that I saw when I was in Chile just in December, where people were saying that one of the in a survey of who they favored on an international stage, who they thought was an incredible leader, they highlighted Bukele, who's the Salvadoran president, who has incarcerated, to come back to this point, incarcerated people, oftentimes with no proof of association, but using the category of gang or likely gang members or organized crime to incarcerate them. So we're in a very fragile moment, an uneasy peace, to use your term in many places, and that political question, I think, is still on the table. So I want to thank the three of you for opening up the conversation. We continue it, and again, let's give them a round of applause.